So, I just watched the Star Wars prequels for the first time since I was a kid, and I gotta say, I was kind of surprised by how much I liked them. Now, I don't think that these movies are perfect. I don't think theirs are a masterpiece, but at the same time, I don't think that they're terrible. That kind of seems to be the consensus, is on one side you have people who say that these movies are a misunderstood masterpiece and they're better than the original trilogy, and then you have people who say that they're an abomination of cinema and it completely ruins Star Wars. I don't really fall on either side, but I would say that I enjoyed the movies more than I disliked them. They are definitely flawed in some areas, but that they are not like this terrible by any means. But that's kind of just my opinion, and I think that's what's kind of so interesting about film and about movies and just art in general, is that there's not only one way to analyze things. There's so many different ways to look at art and look at movies, and what works for one person might not work for another person. And for a movie to really work for you, sometimes it's unexplainable. Sometimes things just really click, and everything in the movie could technically or theoretically be terrible, but everything just clicks and it just really works for you. And other times everything could technically be really good and it should be a great movie, but it just doesn't click with you and you just don't like it. And so, there's always going to be that personal kind of preference on top of everything, and it's not just going to be everyone's going to like the same things. But I think as far as these movies go, it is very, very, very divisive, and you have people very passionate on both sides. And so kind of besides not having seen these movies in forever, I wanted to give them another chance just because I've started to see, I watch a lot of YouTube, and for years and years there's been a lot of very negative YouTube videos about the prequels that go very in depth. There's a pretty popular and famous Red Letter Media review.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son. I mean, how much more could you possibly fuck up the entire backstory to Star Wars?
Which I was a big fan of as a teenager, and I really enjoyed. But more recently I came across another video that kind of was a pretty in-depth look at the prequels and an analysis of how George Lucas used other movies to influence the prequels, and how he references other movies and what that does to the prequels thematically, and how he uses other movies and movie references to tell a story in the prequels. And that's kind of something that I've always been interested in, is how movies influence other movies. And in the past couple months with this channel, that's kind of mostly what I've been posting. It's just when I watch a movie and feel like it's been inspired by another movie, I'll try to make a video about that and post it to kind of show off the similarities. And I know some of those videos have been kind of controversial. Like I had one about Fight Club that a lot of people were really mad at me for on Reddit, and it's just something that I find fun. So when I was watching this video, it kind of intrigued me. There's kind of a narrative, especially in like the Red Letter Media review, that George Lucas doesn't know what he's doing and he knows nothing about movies and he completely ruined the prequels. But kind of this other video posed that he does know exactly what he's doing, but just what he was trying to do is different from what most people wanted.
The point is, it's like if you paint your house white and somebody comes along, well, that should be a greenhouse. Well, fine, but I wanted to paint it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with painting it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with me for painting it white. Maybe it should be a greenhouse. But I didn't want it to be a greenhouse. I wanted it to be a White House.
I think there's a big divide between people who watched Star Wars before the prequels were out and people who watched Star Wars after the prequels were a thing. Because if you watch the original trilogy when it originally released without the prequels, you're spending years and years building up what the backstory is and what it's going to be. And it was always George Lucas's intention, like in his original script for Star Wars, which ended up becoming the script for 4, 5, and 6 because it was too big to fit in one movie. He also had a part about Darth Vader's upbringing and about like a flashback as him as a kid to kind of see his transformation into Darth Vader and to kind of juxtapose kind of the evil of Darth Vader with Darth Vader as a young kid. And we kind of get to see that parallel transformation with Luke Skywalker and kind of see their similarities and see that he kind of came from this innocent place. But I think if you're sitting there coming up in your mind what those movies are going to look like, and then you go and see the prequels are very different than what anyone could have guessed they'd be like. I think a huge reason why the movies are so controversial is because of the heavily used computer special effects. There's a lot of CGI in these movies, but I think at the time when they came out, it was very jarring, and the special effects are not great. They don't necessarily hold up to today's standards. Like, it's very obvious what is CGI and what is actually filmed, and a lot of the movies are filmed on green screen. But at the time, that was a little less common than it is today. And today, you see a lot of the MCU movies are full of computer generated effects. Every movie we see now, it's unavoidable. Every movie has computer generated effects, some more than others. But I think in that aspect, watching it from today's standards, it's kind of easier to accept this integration between CGI and real people. And I think it kind of works. It doesn't look great. It didn't bother me too much. But kind of what I was surprised about when rewatching the original trilogy, because I haven't seen it in a long time, is how bad some of the effects in those movies are. There's a lot of very obvious composite work in those movies, and it really doesn't bother me too much. I mean, it's cool effects. It looks interesting. It obviously took a lot of work to make those models and those ships, but it's very obviously composited, especially like the Endor chase scene in Return of the Jedi. Very, very obvious, and the effects do not blend well with the environment. Always as a kid, I watched these movies on VHS, and I think it covered the effects work like I never noticed it because of the low picture quality. But watching it today on a HD TV, it stands out a lot more. And so when you look at those movies, the original trilogy versus the prequel trilogy, all of them are full of obvious special effects that aren't integrated completely 100% with the rest of the movie and with the environment. But for some reason, people are really willing to accept the original trilogy, but not the prequel trilogy in this regard. And I kind of understand that. There's kind of this feeling among some people that doing something practically is always going to be better than doing it digitally. And I kind of understand the sentiment. Like, if you're working practically, you're really going to have to put a lot of thought and effort into how you're constructing your scene and making your movie, and there's something that feels just more real about it. But at the same time, we're at a point now where digital effects can be integrated so seamlessly that most audience members won't even notice. And I think it more just depends on who's working on the movie and what they're doing. Like, you have David Fincher, who is fantastic at integrating digital effects into his films. His films are full of CGI and digital effects, but it's planned and done in such a way that it's unnoticeable. But I mean, you go watch any one of his movies, Fight Club, Zodiac, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, there are countless CGI shots in those films that you wouldn't even know about. It's just integrated so seamlessly and looks so great, and it just really works for the way he works on his movies. And then you have other directors like Christopher Nolan, who's still really into the practical effects, and people like Quentin Tarantino who, I mean, they're still going to be using some digital effects.
The only visual effect involved in that scene was to remove the ram that they had built inside the truck that actually catapulted it.
They really want to use that practical and film on film and be like a real film. So it really is going to depend on the director, and it's going to depend on the project they're working on. But I think we're at a point now where digital effects have kind of become accepted by the wider film community, and even people who say they're against CGI. What they really mean is they're against obvious CGI. Is that a problem? I don't know, maybe, but not to me. So we've kind of gotten a little off topic here, but kind of moving backwards a little bit. I was saying you have people who are upset by the prequels because they spent all this time kind of thinking what they would be about, and then it turned out to be completely different. I think what has kind of annoyed me, because after I watched these movies, I started listening to a review of them by a YouTube group named Kind of Funny. They used to work at IGN, and they have a podcast where they review movies. And pretty much every episode of this podcast I've ever listened to, I disagree with them on like everything they're saying.
I don't know what the significance of Naboo is to the trade. Is it the center of the fucking galaxy for trade? Why would this one planet being blockaded matter at all?
Yeah, like
to a galactic senate that has literally thousands of planets.
Is there vibranium on there?
But we're never told what that is.
I think that's kind of the point where it's like it doesn't, and that's why it went to investigation instead of them acting on it. You know what I mean?
So a weird thing is, in addition to all of this, like why does this make any sense? Why does this matter? Why is Yoda and Mace Windu on Naboo at the end of the movie?
Yeah, I have so
like why is the Jedi Council
for
there?
Qui-Gon Jinn's funeral, I would imagine, right?
Not only that, but like the biggest travesty of the entire trilogy is that we don't really get to see Sidious become Sidious until like the very end, right? Isn't he like the very end of like of?
Well, no, I mean there's hints of it in the second.
Yeah, but it would have been because Anakin doesn't have a plot arc. Who is the main character of this movie?
Because he's the one who develops
he's
this.
kind of the main character in this movie, and he learns nothing.
And what I noticed while listening to this is a lot of the criticism for the film was, wouldn't it have been cool if this happened instead? Or wouldn't it have been cooler if ...
At all. And the kid, and Anakin should have been this he should have been a kid who was doubting himself, and because of Qui-Gon's a belief in him, stepped out of his comfort zone and then taken on this big journey.
And I think a lot of criticism around these movies kind of follows that structure. You know, what's the point? At that point, why not just go write a fan fiction and then read that and then enjoy that story instead of... Because the point of the movie is not to tell you a story that you want to hear. The point of the movie is to tell the story that the creator wanted to tell. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people get pretty upset with Star Wars. Is for a lot of people, Star Wars is a very personal and emotional story that they connect with deeply. And anything in Star Wars that doesn't go the way they want it to go, that's like twisting a knife into their heart. And I can kind of understand why. I mean, when rewatching A New Hope, it's a very emotional movie. And with all these movies, it kind of plays with the idea of good and evil, and you have this amazing score that makes it for a very emotional experience, and it's very easy movies to connect with on a really emotional level.
He told me you killed him. No, I am your father.
Not true. That's impossible.
Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
Well, it's just one of those movies that everyone connects to, you know. So I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm getting a little off track. My brain is kind of scattering everywhere. But I just wanted to talk about kind of each movie individually, what I like about them, and maybe some of the problems I had. And we're kind of far into this video, but I'm just going to quickly go through each movie at this point. So we have The Phantom Menace, and The Phantom Menace is a movie that I have never understood in my entire life because I watched it as a kid. And the scenes where people are talking just went right over my head. And I was just, get excited during the pod race scene and the fight with Darth Maul at the end. But my eyes are just glazing over during the rest of the movie. And when I watched this when I was younger, I was like literally not able to comprehend what was happening. Like, my mind was not at a point where I could understand what was happening.
Our best choice would be to push for the election of a stronger Supreme Chancellor, one who could control the bureaucrats and give us justice. You could call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum.
So I've never known what this movie was about, or really what any of these movies are about. To me, thinking back on these movies, it's just the fight scenes, and then during the scenes of people talking, it's just like blah, 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 blah. So I was actually pretty surprised rewatching this movie that it has a plot that really makes sense. And a lot of people still complain that it's a very complicated movie. But if you just kind of pay attention to the movie, it's really not that complicated and everything kind of makes sense. Kind of the simple explanation is that you have Palpatine, who is, I think, a senator in Naboo, and he goes out and he pays some people to take over the planet, so then he can leverage that attack to gain more power in the Senate and use that to throw out the current chancellor, because there's a chancellor for the Senate who is very wrapped up, stuck behind red tape. There's a lot of bureaucracy. And so the current chancellor, when Naboo is being attacked, he will not send anyone to go help out. He has to first, set up a group of people to go out and investigate whether a war is actually happening. And this whole movie is like a condemnation and a parallel to what is happening in the real world during the time that these movies were made. So this is very much a commentary on, the Bush era politics, the war in the Middle East, kind of just this whole political sphere. And these movies also end up being kind of a good cautionary tale about fascism and the power we give the government and flaws with the government and how people can rise to power. But that's kind of covered across the whole trilogy. And I think one of the coolest thing about these movies is that there is a overarching story between all three that really is tied in really neatly, and all the movies are obviously planned out really well and all tie together really well. And a lot of people don't think that way. You hear a lot of criticisms about these movies that, the Phantom Menace was pointless. Why even is the Phantom Menace?
What happens in this movie that couldn't have just been in the scroll of the next movie?
In the scroll of the next movie.
What?
Blah, blah, blah. It's so confusing. I didn't understand it. But if you really just sit down and think about it, it works on a few different levels. So one, you have the Palpatine. He's using a war that he's creating to gain more power and get himself elected chancellor in the Senate. Okay, so we have our first thing with Palpatine. We establish Anakin. We get to see him as a kid. And kind of the entire point of this trilogy is to see how do we go from a young boy to Darth Vader. And you can see this even from like one of the first posters for the Phantom Menace was a poster of Anakin as a young boy, and then his shadow behind him is the shadow of Darth Vader. And so we're establishing him, he's too old to be a Jedi. He abandons his mother. People complain because, why didn't they go back and get Anakin's mom? That would have solved everything. But I think that's kind of part of the point of the movie is, and if you actually watch the movie, who's going to be going back to get Anakin's mom? Because you have Qui-Gon Jinn, who seems to be the only one who cares, and he's dead by the end of the movie. You have Padme, who after this movie doesn't see Anakin for, the next 10 or 15 years or however long is between this movie and the next one. And then you have Obi-Wan, who never met Anakin's mother, and he's part of the Jedi Council. And the whole point of being a Jedi is letting go. You got to let go of people. You can't have these attachments. You need to just let go and meditate, and you just have to become one with the Force. And that's why Anakin was too old in this movie, is because he has such a strong attachment to his mother that he's not able to let go. And so we're establishing that in this movie, and we're establishing maybe some flaws with the Jedi, which is a big part of this prophecy of bringing balance to the Force. We're establishing a lot of things that get resolved in later movies, but people point to as flaws. Now, problems with this movie, a lot of people hate Jar Jar. I actually didn't mind Jar Jar. I thought he was kind of goofy. This is kind of more of a kid's movie with the whole Anakin angle, and it really didn't bother me that much. I mean, the special effects, some of them don't really hold up. This movie's not perfect. I mean, the pacing is a little bit off. I feel like it's a little long. I don't know. There's just a lot of small things that bothered me, but overall, I liked mostly everything. I liked all the stuff that people dislike, and I don't know why, but I was so engaged watching this movie for the most part. I was sitting down and I was like interested the entire time, and it really surprised me because I was paying attention. I was interested in what was happening with the plot, and there's kind of a lot of interesting things. You kind of have this mystery angle where you have the Jedi's doing this trade dispute, and then they are attacked and they're trying to figure out what happens, and you have the Naboo being taken over. And I don't know, it just worked for me. Not a perfect movie, you know, it has its flaws, but overall, I liked it more than I disliked it. And then, some other things I really like, the music. I think that this movie has like the best music out of all the movies. And then we go into the Clone Wars, and this movie, we're kind of expanding on what happened in the last movie. We get to see Palpatine continue to rise to power, and by the end of the movie, he is granted like emergency powers that give him more control over everything because of the war that they're in. And kind of the plot of this movie is the separatist movement has grown bigger. They're trying to break away from the Republic, and the Republic doesn't have an army. And so if the separatists are able to gain enough power and influence, they could be able to overthrow the Republic, because the Republic doesn't have any defense. And so the opening of this movie is the Padme assassination attempt, and then we get Obi-Wan, who goes off to investigate the assassin. And I really enjoyed this whole aspect of the movie. It kind of has a similar vibe to a movie like Chinatown. And I know that sounds dumb. I know this movie is not Chinatown.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that this has a sequence that is similar in some ways to a film like Chinatown. And that's kind of cool to get something like that from Star Wars. Now, obviously, if I wanted to watch a neo-noir movie, I'd just go watch Chinatown, and Chinatown is a much better movie than this. But it's cool to see aspects I liked from a movie like that in this movie. So in this movie, we get to see Anakin as he finally gets reconnected with his mother. He's having visions that she's going to die. So he goes and he tracks her down. And during this whole time, he's paired up with Padme, and they kind of start to fall in love and become emotionally and romantically attached to each other. And so we get to see him lose his mother, and he still has this attachment to her, and he's very, very upset. And at the same time, we get to see him, become attached with this new person, with Padme, with his love interest. And so we're really here establishing what his downfall is going to be, which is that he's too attached and he's not able to let things go. Now, should he let things go? If he wants to be a Jedi, yes. I mean, ultimately, that's part of being a Jedi, is you have to just let things go. From a human emotional perspective, it seems like he's not really that bad of a guy. You know, he really likes his mom. He's really upset that she died. He's really attached. And it's very understandable. And I think that's kind of a big reason why these movies worked for me, is it kind of humanizes Anakin, and all his motivation and backstory really makes sense, and it makes sense in a way that you can see how he's able to be emotionally manipulated so much in the next movie. And I think everything is set up really perfectly, and we really get to see how this child becomes Darth Vader in a way that makes sense. The rest of this movie, oh yeah, Obi-Wan discovers the clones, which is an army that was produced under suspicious circumstances, but the Republic decides to use them anyway because they have no other option. Oh, another thing I thought that was kind of cool that everyone hates is that Boba Fett is a clone of Jango Fett. And I thought this was kind of an interesting relationship between the two, and I thought it was kind of a cool thing. And the way I read it as is that Boba Fett being a clone of Jango Fett, and you get to see Jango kind of training his son Boba, or his clone, is that he is trying to create an identical version of himself to continue what he's doing. It's like a way to be, it's like him trying to be immortal in a way. And I don't know if that was George Lucas's intention or if that's what the movie's trying to say, but that's kind of how I read it. Kind of a cool thing where this guy, you know, he's not going to live forever, so he clones himself, and then he's raising this clone to be a bounty hunter just like him, and kind of training him to take over once he dies, so that another version of himself lives on. And everyone hates that for some reason, but I thought it was pretty cool. It's like, oh, you know, this motivation makes sense. You know, this guy's a bounty hunter. He's going to train this person to continue to make money and carry on his legacy, and it's literally a copy of him. And so, I don't know, I thought that was kind of cool. It kind of makes sense. And what else? I mean, I don't really know what else to say about this movie. It was good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. Again, it's flawed, not perfect, but really for me the highlight is kind of that kind of mystery element with Obi-Wan. The stuff with Anakin and Padme I felt worked. This movie kind of, the acting and dialogue, I don't think it's bad, but it's different from what most movies are like. It's very wooden and very hollow.
By whom? Who's gonna make them?
I don't know. Someone.
You?
Of course not me.
But someone.
And so you need, like, the music in these movies to do a lot of heavy lifting to kind of convey that emotion. And the performances aren't very big. They're very, I don't know, not subtle. I don't know. This is kind of one of the complaints about these movies I can kind of agree with, is kind of the bad acting, I guess. Although I don't think it's bad acting. I think that a lot of the actors, especially Hayden Christensen, has these small moments where they really shine, where they're really able to have these small emotional moments where he'll be crying or he'll have an outburst that I think work for the movies and worked for me. Yeah, so I don't know, I don't have much else to say. Moving on to Revenge of the Sith, this is kind of where everything comes full circle. And this is the movie where the visual effects bothered me the most. I don't know why, but there was some shots that were pretty bad. There were some scenes where, with like the clones being fully CGI, they were not integrated great into the background. And this movie is all about Anakin. He starts to have premonitions of Padme dying, the same way he had of his mother dying. And so he starts to be manipulated by Palpatine as the Jedi are kind of overlooking him. And it's very understandable from his point of view. Like in the movie, it's clear the Jedi don't hate him and they're not trying to step on his toes. But there's kind of a lot going on as you have Palpatine trying to gain more control and more power, and the war's kind of coming to an end. But it's just all perfectly plays into Anakin being able to be emotionally manipulated by this person. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Not really a lot happens in this movie. I was kind of surprised. I mean, it's kind of like you have the beginning where they go rescue Palpatine in that ship, and then you have the middle section where Anakin gets manipulated into becoming Darth Vader, and Obi-Wan goes and fights Grievous, and then you have the end where Obi and Anakin fight. And I mean, it's everything just is kind of wrapped up in a nice little bow. You get all these kind of aspects from the previous movies that all kind of are finally tied together. Yeah, it just works. It's just a good movie. It's a solid trilogy. I think overall I gave all these movies like 3 out of 5 stars, where, you know, I enjoyed them more than I didn't. They have their flaws, not perfect, but I think to call them an abomination of cinema is a bit much, and I don't really agree with that. And so yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on the prequel trilogy. I would just recommend, you know, if you haven't seen these movies in a while, to rewatch them and actually watch the movies. I know there's been a lot of internet discourse that is rather frustrating, as you have people asking whether these movies are better or the sequel trilogy is better or blah blah blah. After watching these movies, I'll have to rewatch the sequel trilogy again. I haven't seen it since it was in theaters, but I think that as a whole, this tells one cohesive story across 3 movies, and I think it's better in that aspect. I think something like The Force Awakens is maybe a more exciting movie. It's a movie with better special effects. It might be like a better, kind of more fun blockbuster type movie, but it really isn't able to kind of tell the story that the prequels are in the way it does. Like, I really enjoyed how these movies were kind of a cautionary tale. They were kind of, you know, a lot of people, there's that meme, it's like poetry, it rhymes, but there's a lot of things in this movie where that kind of makes sense. You kind of see what the intention is, you kind of see how everything ties together, kind of see how these movies don't really exist in a real world logic. It's more of like a fairy tale logic where there's like a moral to the story. You know, people call it like Shakespearean or whatever, which I know everyone makes fun of, but I kind of understand the sentiment where, like in the last movie, it's poetic, you know, Anakin turns to the dark side in order to save Padme's life, but then ultimately him trying to prevent her death is what causes it. And so it kind of becomes this tragic story. And I think it ties in really nicely to the original trilogy, where we get to see the rise of the Empire and then the fall of the Empire, and we get to see the parallels between Anakin and Luke. And we get to see kind of this yin and yang idea where you have Anakin, or Darth Vader, who is like the evil, but he still has good in him. And then you have Luke, who's the good, but he still has this hints of darkness. And you kind of get to see how they come together. Another thing I want to mention is that the prequel trilogy really fleshes out the Emperor. I think that Palpatine, without these movies, would not be as iconic as he is. And I think it really helps with Anakin's redemption to kind of see him before he falls. And I don't know. I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. If you liked this video, this is kind of a little more free flow. Didn't have a script, just kind of me rambling into a microphone. And I guess I kind of did this because normally I have like a million videos where I start writing a script for, and then I just like, I'm writing and editing and writing and editing and writing and editing, and like 95% of those videos I've never made. Like the only video I ever ended up making doing that was, I have a video called Siege Sucks for New Players. I think that's the only video where I wrote out like this whole script and then actually committed to like refining it down and editing it down and then going through and reading it and recording it and then editing. Like that video took like a month to make. And so I think going forward with videos like this, I'm just gonna talk into the mic, record it, and then edit it down maybe a little bit. I'm probably gonna try to edit off like 5 or 10 minutes of this video, just clean up some parts where I'm rambling a little too much, but I mean, we'll see once we get into the editing process what I end up doing. And so thank you to the 14 people who watched this, and thank you to the one person who got this far. Yeah, alrighty.